webinar is the Supply Chain Index, 20 Years in the Making, a focus on process industries. Welcome. I am Constance Quarles, Director of Marketing with Supply Chain Insights. This is part one of 2 installments on this topic, going through 20 years of supply chain and financial data. Our speakers today are Lora, Cecere, CEO and founder of Supply Chain Insights, and Abby Mayer, Research Associate at Supply Chain Insights. The ladies have a lot of great content to cover, so I'm going to quickly go over housekeeping items and then head right into introductions. The Twitter hashtag for our event today is hashtag SCI Webinar. Please feel free to tweet out to your network some fun facts and nuggets of information you may find interesting. We are going to save your questions for the end, but we'll compile them as we go. So when you have a question, go ahead and message it in the chat window to panelists. We will continue this conversation immediately afterwards on Twitter for a Twitter chat from 2 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern. So if by chance we didn't get to your question here on the webinar, there's a second chance on Twitter. Now, without further ado, I would like to pass the baton over to Lora and Abby.
Awesome, Constance, and welcome to everyone on the webinar. It's great to see friends and folks that we've worked with many years to come together today to celebrate the work we're doing at Supply Chain Insights on looking at financial data and benchmarking the supply chain. You know, the supply chain in 2012 is 30 years old, and one of the things that I've learned in the writing of the book Bricks Matter, which we'll publish in December, is that practices and processes are evolving. And I don't think we know enough about the financial data that's underneath our supply chains and the patterns and the evolution of practices and how it ties to the driving of supply chain excellence. So today, what I'm proud to do is to talk about the work that we've been doing at Supply Chain Insights for the last 6 months and looking at financial ratios for the industries, plotting them across the years, and looking at how they correlate to the maturity models in the quantitative studies that we're doing. At Supply Chain Insights, we take supply chain research very seriously. It's why we founded the company, and we're so pleased to have you here today. So with that, let me get started. I'm joined today by Abby Mayer. Hi, Abby. And Abby is the Research Associate at Supply Chain Insights, and she does a lot of the financial work on gathering the data. And you will find Abby very active in our network, the Supply Chain Insights community, and she can do analysis like the ones that we'll show you today for your company. Abby, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
It's so good to have you here today. The work that you've been doing is so exciting, so let's share it with the group. So again, the genesis of this work was for the book Bricks Matter, and we've just sent off the final edited copy. I think we've edited it 25 times to the publisher, and it will publish on December, hopefully 9th, and it's really exciting for me to publish the first book. It's a 30-year evaluation of supply chain practices, looking at the fact that bricks matter. It looks at 3 key points of supply chain. 1, how we've designed manufacturing and distribution centers. 2, how we have defined global organizations across the world for supply chain management. And the 3rd brick, which I think is the very important brick, is the definition of supply chain processes. Now, our webinar today is divided into 3 key sections. First, we'll go through the background of the methodology and what we've learned. Secondly, we will look at what this means, we think, to supply chain excellence and the evolution of the definition of supply chain excellence. Then we'll take a in-depth look at leaders. We're going to look at process industries today. We'll look at the 5 leaders in consumer packaged goods. We'll look at the 3 leaders in the chemical industry, and we'll look at 3 leaders in the pharmaceutical industry. What we're going to do is show how the methodology that we've developed on the supply chain effective frontier can be applied by looking at financial ratios. Now, again, I think we're looking at evolving practices. I think that even though we're 30 years into supply chain management, what we're seeing is, just like the man on this moving sidewalk, the practices are moving very, very slowly underneath his feet. But we as supply chain professionals are moving very fast. We're being propelled by the business. And sometimes we're not even in touch with the fact that these processes or the technologies are changing underneath us. And it's 30 years, but we're still evolving. And we don't have best practices. I think we have evolving practices. Now, every supply chain professional wants to know how they're doing. They want to know, how does my supply chain measure up? And right now, as we look at benchmarking data, we've got issues. We've got self-reported data. I have no value in self-reported data for forecast accuracy or customer service. It's like asking someone to put their weight on their driver's license, right? They never put down the right information. And so it's always overstated. And what we have is both an issue in self-reporting with peer group relevance and the ability to have the data at the same point in time that's relevant with similar data models and holistic views. So I have little value for what is in the market for benchmarking supply chain data on forecast accuracy, customer service, but we can get data from the financial accounting of supply chains on an annual basis. So in the development of the book Bricks Matter, Abby responded to a blog post, and she was a student in London, and she began initial data collection with me in the February-May time period, where we believed that we could go through the financial balance sheets and we could start to look at the definition of financial excellence and the ratios. One of the things we found was that it's pretty hard to get at data. And while we located annual reports, that, the development of this data took a long time. Abby, your thoughts here on this first step?
Right. So we spent the first 4 months from February to May really looking around to see where the data was available. A lot of it is available on investor relations websites for different companies. And I also found data on the SEC website. But the problem is it's so varied and it's in so many different places that it's hard to bring that all together and to present it in a meaningful way.
So then what we did was we began to evaluate which metrics matter, and we built ratios that we think matter against the drivers of the supply chain, whether they're growth or profitability or cycles or complexity. And we had to identify what the right ratios were, and then we had to look at the patterns. So Abby, how did that work go?
Right. So we took a list of all the metrics available, and we decided to work with ratios as opposed to raw numbers, just to make it comparable across size and currency. So when we're working with companies of different size or operating in different areas of the world, we use ratios to standardize all of that information. And then we worked through the metrics to try to understand which metrics were most meaningful for which industry, because they're not all meaningful for every industry.
Right. And then what we started looking at was, what is the potential of the supply chain and who does it best? So we started looking at mapping the 20 years of data, and we're going to show you the last 10 here because I think it's really the last 10 that we see the greatest impact. And one of the things that we see in the last 10 is which supply chains did the best with macroeconomic trends. We had the downturn of the Great Recession. We had some major swings and mergers and acquisitions. And so we're going to show you that. And what we built was a database that allowed us to take the ratios of each of the companies, be able to plot them at the intersections of growth, profitability, cycles, and complexity to be able to see these trends. And Abby, if folks want to see data like this in our community, how would they ask for it? Because we're going to show, I think, some real powerful industry data.
Right. So the three things to be able to build your own charts would be first defining a peer group, so coming up with the companies that you would want to be compared against. The second one would be working with me to choose meaningful metrics and to choose which comparisons you would want to use. And then the third step, once the charts have been built, and what you'll see today, is just examining the year-over-year progression and understanding the evolution of supply chain excellence.
Right. And then our next focus, which is going to be in the future, is really building mathematical equations around supply chain capabilities. And we call this the supply chain index, and we will be building this by each industry. But the work that we're going to be doing with companies and the real definition of the peer groups and the evolution as we work with companies will help us build these formulas. So this is our journey. We're excited about it. The early part of this work is in the book Bricks Matter, which we'll publish in December. But let's show you a little bit of some of the insights that we've learned. First of all, for many industries, they're facing slowing growth. So while the chemical industry saw a very large growth rise in the 2004 to 2007 period, at a volume level, the growth is slowing. While price is high, the volume is slowing for many companies. Consumer products is very similar. We raced to build the geographical organization, but now we have slowing growth, and we also have that in food and beverage. Only high-tech and electronics and pharmaceutical are seeing high growth rates. But in pharmaceutical, as we get into the patent cliff, where we have many drugs coming off patent, supply chain is meaning more and more. We no longer have the margins that we've seen before. Now, we have built in many industries cash, and very large cash reserves as people are looking at what will they do. And so while we have had periods where we have been more conservative. Right now, many companies are sitting on cash. And we've come through the era of mergers and acquisitions. So free cash flow ratio is something that we're plotting very carefully. Now, over 30 years, what have we talked about? Let's reduce inventory. And what have we not done? Reduced inventory. Only the high-tech and electronics industry has been successful in reducing inventory. For most industries, they have pushed inventory and waste back in the supply chain. And only high-tech and electronics, which has both a short cycle, they have a margin issue if they do not sell through the goods, and they also have had higher advancement in supply chain excellence, have really been able to power down inventory. And when we look at days of working capital, we see the same thing. And in fact, in pharmaceutical, we see working capital going up. In chemicals, we also see working capital going up. And so supply chain fundamentals, while we have implemented enterprise resource planning and advanced planning systems, and almost every one of those projects has been tied to an inventory reduction. Overall, as industries, only the high-tech and electronics industry has been successful in reducing both inventory and working capital. And part of that is just the definition of supply chain excellence and who's responsible for supply chain excellence. So here we are 30 years into supply chain management, and this is an analysis I did for a recent conference that I presented at, but we're seeing similar data in the quantitative studies that we're doing. The number one issue for supply chain individuals is the ability to get at data, and a lot of it is the ability to get at financial data. 85% of companies cannot get to total financial cost. And the issue and understanding of supply chain excellence among the executive team, the holistic understanding as we talk about the movement from vertical orientation and excellence to horizontal understanding, is lacking. In fact, many companies are struggling to build the T-shaped manager that can really help to build the end-to-end value proposition. And it starts with the understanding of the executive team. So data and the ability for the executive team to use it is a big gap. And a lot of it comes down to our ability to pull up the seat as supply chain professionals and to be able to have the financial discussion. And that's what this research is designed to do, to help you to understand financial ratios, how the financial ratios have changed over time, and how they really align to supply chain excellence. So in the building of the book Bricks Matter, I interviewed 75 supply chain pioneers. the guys that had the boots on the ground, wore the first safety shoes and hard hats. And they talked about the evolution of supply chain management in the very beginning was all about efficiency. It was about the lowest cost. It was about really streamlining procure to pay in order to cash. But what they quickly found out was that wasn't sufficient, because as they became more cost effective, as they sweated assets, that they didn't have a reliable supply chain. They didn't have the customer service to be able to give the right product at the right place, the right time, at the right cost. And so we saw this concept of balance, of inventory, and forecast accuracy and customer service. But as we became global, that wasn't sufficient, because we needed to absorb demand volatility. We needed to absorb supply volatility. And so we got into the discussion around sensing and postponement and alternate bills of material and alternate ways of designing the value network and reducing latency in the network. And 5 years ago, when I worked for another analyst company, I began the discussion about demand-driven, and that's been 5 years ago, which was around sensing demand and supply and shaping demand and supply based upon market. It's still aspirational, but in the book, Bricks Matter, I talk about being market-driven, not marketing-driven, but being market-driven, aligning bidirectionally, market-to-market, to orchestrate, which I think means building horizontal process connectors of supplier development, S&OP, revenue management, corporate social responsibility, and building this T-shaped manager that can really work with the financial and the executive teams to be able to drive the understanding of end-to-end and really help us with building continuous learning, testing, and using new forms of predictive analytics to orchestrate demand and supply. But it's aspirational. Market-driven and demand-driven are aspirational. But I got to tell you, supply chain matters. And as we look at the evolution, people want a responsive supply chain. They're just not sure how to get there. And it requires, I think, redefining supply chain excellence, helping to educate the executive team, and being able to get at data. And so many times people have implemented ERP systems or advanced planning systems, and they haven't thought about the financial metrics and the data. In fact, I was teaching a workshop in Australia last week where we went through the ratios, and they said, if only we had started here and made sure that we could map all the inputs into the ratios and then use the ratios in our scorecards, things would have been so much better. And I said, I agree. And in fact, because we started at project level and we look at process, not at holistically at how we use ratios and metrics, we often can't get at the data. So what is the supply chain? You know, I've thought a lot about this over the last year as I've sat and I've written the book Bricks Matter. A supply chain is a complex system. It's a system of trade-offs. It's about the ability to drive balance. And yes, we have increasing complexity with complex processes, and I see a lot of writing and a lot of research around the complex processes, but I don't see it around the complex system. And that's what I want to share with you today. And I built a model because I think as we look at the typical organization, we have the back office folks, the folks that are all about cost. These are guys in manufacturing. They typically are very siloed. And we have the sales team, the guys that are really focused on volume. And we have the marketing guys, which are very focused on growth and market share. But it requires the building of these horizontal connectors to be able to manage the effective frontier of the supply chain as a complex system. Because I believe at the top, we really want to power profitable growth. And we want to trade off revenue and cost of goods sold, but we don't necessarily have that data. In fact, I talked about only 85% of companies can really get at total cost numbers for the supply chain. And we want to balance working capital, but we've not been able to. And one of the reasons we've not been able to do so is because only 8% of companies today have sufficient what-if capabilities in their organization. They just didn't build it into their project-based ERP and APS systems. And they don't have plans today to really embrace these new forms of predictive analytics to go get it. And you're not going to get at working capital unless you do. And now we have the new evolution of corporate social responsibility and what that means. And we've got to balance our asset strategies for R&D with our asset strategies for manufacturing. And then we get to the typical supply chain metrics of forecast accuracy, customer service, and inventory, which are very affected by our channel strategies, our product strategies, our supplier strategies, but we don't have tools around financial analysis of these strategies for cost to serve and product profitability, and I think that is really an important step as we look at 2013. Instead, we look at the bottom of this. We look at waste. We talk about back orders. We talk about lost miles. We talk about first pass yield. And I think as we deal with the supply chain as a complex system, we've got to look at the trade-offs. We've got to look at how does this come together to really be able to power growth. And as we look at the metrics that Abby and I have been working on mapping per industry, and today we're going to talk about the process industries, and next month we're going to do the discrete industries. We're looking at profitability, cost of goods sold, free cash flow, gross margin, net income, operating margin, and growth, cost of goods sold to the revenue ratio, R&D margin, R&D to cost of goods ratio, selling, general, and administrative expense, SG&A to cost of goods sold, year-over-year sales growth. One of the interesting things I find in the data is that the most mature supply chains actually have the greatest impact on sales and general administration. Who would have known? And then as we look at cycle, we're looking at cash-to-cash cycles, days of inventory, days of payable, days of sales outstanding, days of payable outstanding to the DSO ratio, inventory turns, and complexity. What is the Altman Z ratio, which is a ratio of risk, the current ratio, the quick ratio, the return on assets, the return on equity, return on invested capital, return on net assets, and revenue per employee. Whoa, Abby's been busy doing a lot of runs. Because what we're trying to do is figure out who's best in class. And we figure that the best-in-class company is the company that has performance better than peer group, year-over-year improvements, consistency in results despite what's happening in the market, and leadership in managing these trade-offs as a complex system. So with that, Abby, let's look at the leaders. What Abby did was she took 5 companies in the CPG space, and we took 3 companies in the chemical space, and we took 3 companies in the pharmaceutical space, and we're going to show you how we used the methodology. And these slides are all available on SlideShare for you to use, and we have written a report which we would love to have you use, which is on SlideShare. Constance is going to go through that at the end. Our basis of our research is open research so that it's freely used and distributed. We want to help raise the potential of supply chain executives everywhere. So when we look at these 5 companies, they were all global. They all have supply chain leadership. They have similar technologies. And as we look at the metrics that we wanted to use, we found that the intersection of gross margin cash to cash and the intersection of revenue per employee and inventory turns was very useful. So in the beginning, when we started and we had cash to cash cycle versus gross margin, this was the dawn of ERP. This was the dawn of Y2K. All of these companies had just come out of Y2K projects. So when we look, Colgate struck an early advantage in gross margin. It was very key to their strategy. And Unilever and Procter & Gamble were pretty close on, what they were doing on cash to cash and gross margin. Kraft was next in terms of gross margin, but actually their cash-to-cash cycle went up. Well, they had a lot going on with the, acquisitions and the spinoffs, and Kimberly-Clark had more of a strategy around evolution of supply chain. What happened? In the next period, what we saw was Unilever had a dramatic impact on cash to cash. However, it wasn't around inventory management, it was around payables. And Procter & Gamble and Unilever kept their positions pretty stable. And what we saw was very little variation on Kimberly-Clark and Kraft. Now we get ready to move into the recession. What happens? Unilever loses position on gross margin. Procter & Gamble uses more advanced technologies and processes and really works on global governance to be able to improve cash to cash. Colgate stayed in relatively the same position, a little better improvement on cash to cash. Kimberly-Clark over the last year has made progress in cash to cash. And Kraft pretty much held its own. So what can we learn from this? You know, what we're going to see is, as we look at the averages, the companies come in at a very different place. But these particular companies in the peer group had much less variation going into and out of the recession than the other process industries we're going to show, because they had a better definition of supply chain excellence. Abby, what do you see in the data?
Well, what strikes me here is that the companies that are making the small, gradual improvements, Colgate and Procter & Gamble especially, are the ones that are leading the pack, as opposed to some of the erratic motion amongst their peers.
Right. And I think that in the case of Unilever, while they've done a lot of work on supply chain, they really passed more cost and work backwards in the supply chain on the payables. Now, let's look at inventory turns versus revenue per employee. Similar analysis, okay? Now here we see that Procter & Gamble is actually more advanced than Colgate because the revenue per employee is higher. And as we look at the advancement here on inventory, so now we're just looking at inventory. We're not looking at cash to cash. We're not looking at receivables or payables. We can just see the inventory results. In the 2004 to the 2007 period, we actually see that when Procter & Gamble absorbed Gillette, they were able to not improve the inventory turns, but yet we see all of these companies, despite year-over-year programs, are not really driving up inventory turns. As we move into the recession, we see that we actually see a decrease in inventory turns for Kraft. We see that Kimberly-Clark was able to reverse it some, but we see that Procter & Gamble was able to drive up the returns, and I think it's because of this focus and the use of new forms of predictive analytics that allowed us to do it. When we look at the companies and we look at the comparison group, it almost looks like a modern art picture here, Abby. What do you see here?
I see a lot of, sporadic movement in the middle, and then Procter & Gamble on the far right side is really making improvements in revenue per employee and also driving small improvements in inventory turns, increasing that value year over year.
Well, let's see what the audience thinks. Who do you think was the supply chain leader in this particular industry? Was it Colgate with the better gross margin? Was it Kimberly-Clark that reversed it in the last couple of years? Was it Kraft Foods who worked through mergers and acquisitions? Was it Procter & Gamble that was the revenue per employee leader? Or was it Unilever that did better work on payables? Or can you not tell? There's no leader. Let's get the responses. So, Abby, one of the things that I see in the data, which we see in all industries, is that companies aren't able to have both gross margin excellence and also revenue per employee excellence. What do you see?
Right. I think, and that goes back to the idea of the effective frontier and the trade-offs. And instead of sort of being a victim of the trade-offs, the supply chain leaders are actively controlling their destiny and making conscious decisions and driving, improvements.
Right. And so you'll see now a audience poll on the right-hand side of your panel. If you can just fill that out, that would be great. And, one of the things, though, that we're going to see is that the work in the consumer packaged goods, that this particular industry was actually much more resilient as we looked at the evolution of supply chain practices than we saw on other industries. Let's move on, and Regina will let us know how the poll goes a little later on, so you can fill it out. Let's look at the chemical industry. Okay, here we've got BASF, we've got DuPont, and we've got Dow Chemical. All supply chain leaders. BASF has a lot of work around training and supply chain centers of excellence. DuPont is well known for their work with all of the supply chain organizations. And then we've got Dow Chemical that built a phenomenal center in Midland to really look at supply chain design. Let's look at what happened with these particular companies on a similar comparison. So early on, what we have is BASF has the largest cash-to-cash cycle, and they also have the highest gross margin. And Dow has the shortest cash-to-cash cycle, but also the lowest margin. And when we look at the change over year, we don't see much change. However, you can see that there is some change in the cash-to-cash cycle, And, you know, as we look at the evolution through the recession, which this is 2008 to 2011, you can see unlike the consumer packaged goods companies, which tended to have more of flat lines, coming out of the recession for the chemical industries, we see these humps that cause a deterioration of the cash-to-cash cycle, but not much movement on gross margin. And overall, if we look at the chemical industry, what we see is that these particular industries, while there is some movement, that these three companies stayed pretty much in their zones, with BASF doing better on margin with much longer cash-to-cash cycles, Dow Chemical doing less well on gross margin, and you know, being able to do better on cash-to-cash, and DuPont in the middle of the pack. But when we look at inventory turns versus revenue per employee, what we see is a reversal, that Dow is able to have better revenue per employee and to have better cash-to-cash, better inventory turns. To keep this leading up to the recession, we saw that we made improvements on revenue per employee, which is actually one of the things that we see with global ERP implementations is an improvement in revenue per employee. And we made modest improvements in the inventory turns. But with the recession, we were kicked back on our heels, particularly if you look at the Dow numbers, and the organization was not as resilient. So as we look at the comparison of these industries numbers across the chemical peer group, what we see is that the companies had relatively the same zones in working here, and that there was a lack of resilience in this particular industry with the recession that we didn't see in the consumer products industry. Abby, your thought?
When I look at this chart, what I see is that the companies are following similar trajectories, so they're all starting in the lower left and moving to the upper right, but like you said, they're remaining in their separate zones during that evolution.
Okay. Right. And so let's look now at the pharmaceutical industry. You know, if we look at Abbott Labs and we look at Merck and we look at Pfizer, you know, when we look at these particular industries, what we've got is a similar progression where we've got, you know, the comparison of year-over-year sales, gross margin, and our cash-to-cash cycles. And again, what we see is a very distinct pattern where we've got Pfizer with better gross margins, and we've got the ability for cash-to-cash cycle management here in the pharmaceuticals. And if we think back, the pharmaceutical companies do much worse on management of cash-to-cash cycles and inventory than either consumer products or the chemical industry. And we see that on this particular slide, the movement of this particular industry as we take the next period of time, we actually see that the cash-to-cash cycle starts to move down for Pfizer. It starts to move down for Merck, and we see that Abbott Labs stays in approximately the same spot. The companies, however, stay in relatively the same zones on gross margin. However, with the recession, look what happens. Abbott is more resilient. They don't have nearly the impact on gross margin as we see with Merck and Pfizer, but we don't see the impact of the recessionary swings. The other thing is, as we look at the averages, we see that Pfizer does better on gross margin, and we see that all of the companies, with the exception of Abbott, have a great impact here on the cash-to-cash cycle with post-recession. Now, when we look at revenue per employee versus inventory turns, we get, again, a different picture. So the inventory turns for Abbott are very high. The inventory turns for Merck and Pfizer are lower. And as we look at this evolution of Y2K type of implementations and we look at year-over-year results, we see that Pfizer is actually able to increase their turns, and of course this is right before the recession and right before we have all the mergers and acquisitions in this industry. Merck is able to somewhat improve the position on both inventory turns and revenue per employee. And Abbott also goes up and down, but is able to make some improvements. But whoa, look at the impact of the recession. Again, the pharmaceutical industry, because it's less resilient, has a greater movement here than we saw in consumer packaged goods, and about the same movement that we see in the chemical industry. So again, one of the things we see is that companies are not able to have both the best gross margin and the best revenue per employee, and that it's very hard for organizations that do not have a well-ingrained department and focus on supply chain excellence to be resilient, to absorb demand and supply variability through the downturns and upturns, to be able to drive continuous improvement, and that supply chain is a complex system with complex processes with increasing complexity. So who do we think is the supply chain leader for pharmaceuticals? Is it Abbott Labs? Is it Merck? Is it Pfizer? We can't tell. There's no leaders. There's a poll on the right-hand side. If you can fill it out, we'll see what folks think. So Abby, what do you see in this data?
Well, I think it's interesting when you see some companies making really small incremental changes. Abbott comes to mind in the pharmaceutical industry. And you see some of those larger swings happening with Merck and Pfizer especially.
Right, right. Now, if people like the type of analysis that we've done today and you would like to have a custom analysis done for your company, or perhaps you're a technology company that wants to see what this looks like for companies, we're just beginning to really go into a year project to really be able to look at these ratios, look at the patterns, and we'd like to partner with you. We've built a community that's called the Supply Chain Insights Community, and in the community is Abby to run this kind of analysis and to help you out. And also, we would love to have people join us. This is Karen Conway, featured on our leaderboard. Karen is actually head of communications at GHX. And continue the discussion there around what is supply chain excellence, because the processes are evolving. And then, you know, if we look at the wrap-up, you know, supply chain's 30 years old. The definition of supply chain excellence is evolving. We believe that the best supply chains can be measured by really looking at the financial balance sheet, not at individual numbers, but at ratios, and by supply chain leaders that are conversant and can have the discussion to talk about why supply chain matters at the balance sheet level. We've got a lot of data in the industry around benchmarking, and it's really not very helpful because it's self-reported, it's overstated, and it lacks a common data model. What we would like to do is help supply chain professionals everywhere to better be able to use financial data and to understand the potential. So with that, Constance, who did we get for the response of the polling questions, and what questions do we have from the audience?
Sure. So Regina could probably help us out with the poll results. But in the meantime, let me go through a couple of the audience questions. Jim Class had a question. Do you have a breakout of the distribution side of the supply chain in food and beverage?
Yes, we do. In fact, we have that analysis ready, and it's in a report that will actually be published this week. So one of the issues that we see in the food and beverage is that these particular industries do not have as much of a pattern that separates them. The patterns are much more overlapping, which shows that there really is not a distinctive difference in food and beverage. We also do not see that food and beverage has nearly the swings that we saw on the particular resilient indication on the downturn of the recession. And we also see that they're much more subjective to commodity pricing.
Great. And it looks like Regina is posting some poll results.
Right.
Yeah, so did you ladies want to go through how the audience selected their answers here?
Right. And so on the pharmaceutical industry, when we compare Abbott, Merck, and Pfizer, you know, it looks like that, you know, for people that thought that they could tell a difference, it was, you know, neck and neck, Abbott versus Pfizer. But, you know, by and large, people are saying they can't tell. There's no leader. There's no answer. And I think in the case of pharmaceutical, that's true. What we have, I think, is a lot of data, and I think we've got a lot of patterns, but I think excellence in the pharmaceutical industry is still yet to be defined. I think that the high margins of pharmaceuticals has really not driven a leader in pharmaceuticals yet. So Regina, let's see consumer packaged goods, and also let's see the chemical industry. What did we have there? Because the consumer packaged goods is much more advanced in terms of supply chain definition and leadership. And there what we see is Procter & Gamble is rated the highest. And I think Procter & Gamble does show that across that particular peer group that they have driven year-over-year excellence, and particularly with the last work that they've done, they have been able to really drive up the potential of the supply chain through supply chain sensing, how they've defined global governance, and how they've managed the supply chain as a total system. One of the interesting things I found in the book Bricks Matter is that the Procter & Gamble organization in 1985 decided that they would put source, make, deliver under the same leadership team. And so they began earlier to look at the building of horizontal processes. And often I write about Procter & Gamble and Colgate and Unilever on my blog, and I'll get people that are, you know, very negative about Procter & Gamble, or very negative about Colgate, or very negative about Unilever. I don't think any one of these companies does everything right. I think each of the companies gives us good places to learn. However, I think that Procter & Gamble on this peer group showed better year-over-year improvement coming out of the recession, and was also able to show continuity of performance. So now let's look at the chemical group, Regina. Because I think that, again, the chemical industry is more advanced in their supply chain concepts than the pharmaceutical. But here again, the overwhelming answer is no answer. Can't tell there's a leader. Now I find it very interesting that some companies or people believe that you can put all industries in a spreadsheet and you can shake them up, and that, you know, there is one supply chain leader. I think both are false. I don't think we can compare Dow Chemical to Samsung. I think that we can only compare Dow Chemical to its peer group. I also don't think that we can compare 1 year or 3 year snapshots. I think we have to look at year-over-year performance over time. And I think we've got to be able to look at the supply chain as a complex system against all these ratios, against all these patterns, and to look at how it evolves. So I think that I would agree with the data that we see a clearer leader in consumer packaged goods than we do in pharmaceuticals or chemical. Abby, your thoughts?
I would agree. I think it's hard, you know, this analysis is so new, and so if we don't have that clear definition or understanding of supply chain excellence, it's really difficult to crown a leader in those different industries.
Constance?
Lora and Abby, do you find, are you surprised by the results, or do you feel that, you know, most folks are really having challenges and they really don't know and they can't tell who the leader is?
I'm not surprised by the results. I think that this kind of analysis is very new. I think that the definition of supply chain excellence is evolving. I think the ability to look at it holistically is a new concept. And I think that year-over-year results, you know, this is one of the reasons why we've not been able to maintain year-over-year results on both inventory and working capital.
Okay. Enrico Tamarinelli, and I hope I pronounced your name right, has a question: why correlate inventory turns with revenue employee?
Revenue per employee, because it was an interesting pattern. What we were doing was we were looking at the intersections of these particular groups of financial metrics to look at distinctive patterns between companies where we could see discrete differences, and it was an interesting pattern. And I think that revenue per employee, we've seen the greatest impact of that through the automation of the global supply chain. I think that is really one of the greatest value propositions of ERP. And you know, the ability to manage inventory has been a challenge as companies have gone globally. So we thought it was an interesting pattern, and we think that particular intersection usually defines supply chain excellence.
Great. Enrico also mentioned, I would consider economic profit rather than gross margin. Gross margin does not take into account the impact of assets, which are so important for the industries you are analyzing. Any comments to that?
I think there is, you know, wisdom in that, and I think that's something we're going to continue to work on. We're still working on this methodology, and we would welcome a peer group analysis to be able to look at that.
Great. I have another question. Were there product technology realities behind the different zones of operation for the companies, or can any company operate anywhere?
No, I think that there are distinctive potentials around what we do around product inputs and the definition of products. And so, you know, I think it's sort of like as we work with our bodies in fitness, right? I'll never be a triathlete. My body just doesn't have that potential. Likewise, the product definition for a DuPont or a Dow gives them a very distinctive zone. What they've got to do is they've got to work on improvement on their zone. And that's why I think that benchmarking without looking holistically against the group of metrics is really not a smart idea, because we've got to understand our zone. Just like when we train to be an athlete, we've got to look at weight and inches and time. It's very similar to the benchmarking of the supply chain.
Great. Mike Higgins says, great research. Are you able to filter out of the financial results abnormal events that impact results? For example, a large acquisition could significantly impact gross margin and SKU results.
Yes, we can. And in fact, as we work with people in the community, and we would love to have people come in, we can actually take out the data, and all you have to do is work with Abby on that. People that are really steeped in the industry will recognize a material event or the impact of a merger and acquisition that we might not be as in tune to. And so that's why we really want to work with supply chain leaders across the globe to be able to look at the patterns in this data and to be able to do an evaluation of why supply chain matters. We will then take the data and we will start to correlate it in our quantitative data to be able to look at how best practices really tie to financial balance sheet data.
Okay. Any other questions? Please chat your questions into the chat window to the panelists, and we'd be more than happy to go over your questions. Lora and Abby, any closing thoughts before we get into some housekeeping?
Well, Abby, you've been working on this now for a year, right? Any advice for people and the use of the data?
You know, I learn something new from every slide deck I run, so I would just encourage people to come, and, you know, I'm more than willing to work with different companies and, you know, to run different metrics depending on what they would like to see and have a conversation about how we can learn and how we can improve supply chain excellence as a whole.
Right. Yeah, you know, it's amazing to me, Abby, that most supply chain professionals can't get to this data, and they aren't able to look at a decade's worth of data. And even though it may seem overwhelming at first, this concept of being able to manage supply chain as a complex system, you know, we should never look at inventory in isolation. We should look at inventory as a function of that complex system. We should never look at gross margin in isolation. And so if any one thing that I hope people take away from this is the management of a complex system and the management of a group of metrics and the need for the supply chain professional to be able to pull up the table to have the financial discussion and the fact that supply chain processes are evolving. We at Supply Chain Insights want to be part of that understanding of the evolution. That's why the book Bricks Matter is going to publish in December, and that's why we're going to continue to plot these ratios and hopefully work with folks like you and the community to get a better understanding of supply chain excellence. Constance, with that, if there are no more questions, I think we're done.
Okay. Okay, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, especially Lora and Abby for sharing such great content. And I wanted to send you off into Twitter where we're going to continue the conversation. Follow along and participate with hashtag SCI webinar. A lot of you folks were looking for the slides. The slides will be available on SlideShare as well as our website, supplychaininsights.com. That is typically how we work here. We always share our research and our slides in front of the firewall. So take a look at our supplychaininsights.com website. If you go to the research report page, you will find an interesting report called Conquering the Supply Chain Effective Frontier. And by the end of the week, we also will have our Supply Chain Index research report. Friend me, as well as Lora, Abby, and the whole SCI team in our Supply Chain Insights Community.com network. Let's continue this conversation over there as well. I look forward to meeting you. I see you on October 26th for the next installment of our webinar series, Supply Chain Index, a focus on discrete industries. Thank you and have a great day.